this recent election is not the game changer that people think it is. That awakening that's surging among men in the city, all over the Western world, that's about to kick into gear. These are the three major trends or developments in the world that are driving everything. They're driving economies, they're driving the price of gold, they're driving masco-nationalism, they're driving military power, the rebalance of power in the world. The West is entering into the eye of the storm. Welcome back to Men and the City. I hope you're all doing well. And to those of you that are big Donald Trump supporters, congratulations. It was a hard-fought victory, but it looks like a total rout of Kamala Harris. And regardless of your political orientation, and I'm not a big Trump supporter, as most of you know, but regardless of your political orientation, I think trouncing Kamala Harris was a step in the right direction at a minimum. She was, I think, self-evidently disqualified to ever be president, and at least the American electorate recognized that. So that's a very good thing. That being said, given the timeline that we're on, the end of cycle period, the transition into the next world, I thought today's video we could talk a little bit about the major trends that are going to drive the rest of the decade. And to some degree, the importance or lack thereof of this election. I don't think this election by any means is a game changer, but it's not insignificant or meaningless either. So today's video, we're going to talk about the last election. You know, it's interesting when I think about elections and democracy, I think back to 2008, because 2008, and a lot of people didn't really emphasize it at the time. Some people did, but a lot of people, especially sort of mainstream thinkers, and at that point alternative media was just a shadow of what it is today. But at that time, people didn't really understand what was most important about that election. And for me, what was most important about that election is that for the first time in American history, more or less, in the modern age anyway, a majority of the majority demographic voted against the president-elect. And at the time, of course, that was Barack Obama, and I'm talking about the white population in the United States. A majority of the white population voted against him, both in 2008 and in 2012. What I took from that was basically that the demographic balance of the country had shifted so decisively against the founding population in America that elections, as far as we're concerned, were no longer meaningful. In other words, you couldn't vote yourself out of that demographic problem. In large measure, that's turned out to be correct. Now, Donald Trump's election in 2016 did disrupt that a little bit. And the reason for that was because he reactivated, he animated that demographic base in ways that were unanticipated. And so the polling data in the lead up to Trump's victory in 2016, as most of you know, indicated strongly that Donald Trump would lose. And the reason for that was because it emphasized likely voters. Those polling numbers were correct. The difference was that he was able to get new supporters to come out for him. And it looks like in 2024, this go round, some 8 years later, he's been able to cultivate support beyond that foundational ethnic bloc, the white demographic. That being said, why do I call it the last election? Well, it's the last election because ultimately Donald Trump was not the reform candidate, or will not be the transformational candidate that a lot of people think. He's trying to breathe life into a legacy system that just doesn't work anymore. That's completely broken. And my fear is that the ground around him, or the foundation underneath him, is going to start to give, and give pretty quickly, right after he takes office in January, maybe beforehand. We'll have to see. But that's the first theme that I want to call attention to, and that is that the legacy structure of the Western world, the political structure, the economy, the sense of pluralism, this sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic, democratic balance that we've created over the last 50 years is really going to start to wane. It's going to start to break in significant fashion, and that's regardless of Donald Trump's victory, which, as I said, I don't think moves the needle in any meaningful sense. If you look carefully at what's happening today in the bond market, that tells the truth. And what's happening across the Western world, specifically in the United States, but not America alone. It's happening in Germany, it's happening in France, it's happening in the United Kingdom as well, is that interest rates are really beginning to skyrocket. And this is at a precarious time because economies in the Western world are not very strong. They're not strong in the United States either, despite what a lot of people in the mainstream press say. And the evidence for that, I think, is pretty self-evident, so I'm not going to dwell upon it. But at a minimum, we know that inflation is still a big problem. It's structurally high. The cost of living is a crisis in the United States for most Americans. At the same time, there just aren't very many good jobs left. Manufacturing is not the dynamo that it once was. The middle class is really hurting. And a lot of people are living in what's called the gig economy as a result. In other words, they're basically doing part-time work, and they're doing a lot of part-time work to make ends meet. That's not the basis for a strong economic recovery.
We've lost 1 million full-time jobs in the last year. In the same time, we've created 1.3 million part-time jobs. The gig working economy, there are more part-time working Americans today than there were at the height of the financial crisis.
And maybe they have 2 or 3 jobs.
Thirdly is we have a very serious banking crisis that's developing that, again, isn't being talked about, but Bank of America is underwater. I think they have something like $500 billion in unrealized losses.
Now, when it comes to Bank of America, they were the largest buyer, and they purchased around $700 billion of these long-term bonds, which is roughly 1/3 of the total amount of the entire banking system's purchases during 2020.
That's ultimately going to matter. It's going to come to count, I think, a lot sooner than people realize. Similarly, you have banks like UBS, which absorbed Credit Suisse when it went bust a couple years ago. That bank is in trouble. So is Deutsche Bank. The banks reflect the economy. The economy's not doing well. That means loans are not profitable for the banks. It means that a lot of assets that were formerly valued up here are falling in value because interest rates are rising. And interest rates reflect confidence, not just in governments, but confidence in the economy. And that's why they're rising, because there isn't that confidence. So legacy governments, and as I said, this sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy that we've been living under for the last 50 years, it's really going to start to crater. And Donald Trump is the last gasp of life that the system itself is trying to breathe back into it. It's not going to work. It's just not going to hold up. The second major theme, and perhaps the most important for the Western world, is the awakening. It's the growing awareness of what I've talked about before, the neo-masculine consciousness that's rising in young men in particular. But I think across the Western world, people are beginning to realize that we're facing a very serious crisis, a crisis of identity. Our sovereignty is under threat. And obviously that's manifest in various ways. It's not just that our institutions are crumbling. It's not just that they've been subverted. It's that our very sense of identity as Western peoples, whether we're Germans or we're French or we're Dutch, that's coming under strain. And we've hit a critical mass. We've hit a turning point in which we are either going to turn back, we're going to push back against these forces that are trying to overwhelm and destroy us, or we're going to sort of sit there and let the tide just wash over us and destroy us. I don't think it's going to go that way. I think the pushback is just starting. I think the evidence for that is legion across the Western world. You could point to Trump to some degree, but I would say if you really look at the alternative media, if you look at young men that are pushing farther and farther and farther to the right, that are becoming more hyper-conscious, that are becoming more masculine, neo-masculine as I put it, that's evidence in the United States especially that something big is coming, that a permutation is happening. And I think across the board, people realize there's just too many foreigners, there's too many immigrants, the economy's not strong, there's too much corruption. And so the instant that people realize Trump can't solve it, that recognition is going to kick into gear. What does that mean? I think it means political action. Eventually, it's going to mean a third party. That's where we're headed. Europe is already there. Opposition parties are strong, and they're getting stronger. This is what the European elections demonstrated this summer. We've seen parties like AfD in Germany, the Freedom Party in Austria, the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, all get stronger. At the same time, in another Anglo country like the United Kingdom, confidence in the legacy parties, specifically the Tories and Labour, which just had a historic victory itself to some degree, there's a complete disillusionment with both. What is happening to Keir Starmer, who's the Prime Minister of England today, what's happening to him, which is this sort of sharp rise of opposition against him and a collapse in his poll numbers, I fear is exactly what's going to happen to Donald Trump. Labour was seen as the answer, the antidote to 2 decades of Tory rule or right-wing rule, conservative rule in England that was anything but. It was just a total disaster. They didn't do anything about immigration. They made the economy worse. They signed up for all the wars, as we know. A very similar thing, I think, is going to befall Donald Trump, and that's when Americans are going to realize, just as Britons are beginning to realize, that the establishment itself, the entire architecture, the two-party system, the parliamentary structure in Great Britain, the elites that run the government, these people need to be thrown out full stop. We're just not there yet, but I think it's going to happen. On the continent, in addition to Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Italy, where Meloni has gotten stronger, and while she has been a disappointment to some, she is a vociferous opponent to the European Union. She doesn't really support the war against Russia either, and she wants to do more about immigration. She's a bellwether. Italy's only going to get farther and farther to the right. It's not going to revert back to the left. That's not going to happen. But across the European continent, ultimately what's going to happen is the European Union is going to come apart. And I think it's going to come apart because of what's happening in France. The socialists that basically kept Rassemblement National, which is the national rally, from holding any meaningful power in France. What they have done is consolidated around a wish list of budgetary promises that the French public thinks they're going to get, and they're not going to get. They're not going to get the goodies that previous generations have. And as a result, the French population is going to get very, very angry, and they're going to take their anger out on the European Union. And the European project as a whole is going to crumble. Obviously, that's been compounded by the disastrous confrontation and war against Russia in Ukraine that has destroyed the German economy. I mean, as we speak, the most important company in Germany, which is Volkswagen, is shutting down factories. They're laying people off. There are strikes across Germany and very real anger because of what the German government, the coalition government, led by Olaf Scholz, and the Social Democrats, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, etc., what they've done is strip the industrial capacity of Germany completely. They have spiked energy costs to fulfill this ridiculous green agenda that they have. So they're going to be out of power soon as well. And that's going to fuel all of these opposition parties that much more. So the second major theme is that there's an awareness, there's an awakening happening, and it's beginning to manifest across Europe and the United States. And what's holding all this together is a resurgent sense of national identity, of Masco-nationalism in young men. That is the key, and that's happening across the Western world. And I think that's going to converge eventually. And that relates to a lot of the messaging I do on this channel, as well as a lot of the work that I do. I think that reality is coming. The third major trend in the world today is the rise of the East. I saw a statistic this past week that showed that trade among BRICS members, basically China with all of the other South Asian, Eurasian countries and beyond, is now bigger than it is between China and the United States and Europe combined. That is a staggering development. And what that tells you is that the East, despite its troubles internally, and they have them, are pushing an industrial, manufacturing, resource-driven strategy that's beginning to work. Their power is rising. This recent summit in Kazan is, as Alexander Dugin said, the consolidation of a multipolar world, a world in which the East, and when I say the East, really it encompasses 4, 5, or 6 different civilizations, depending on how you want to look at it. You have powers like China, obviously, which is Sinic civilization. You have India, which is Hindu civilization. You have Russia, which is Orthodox Christian civilization. You have Brazil, which represents Latin America, and the sprinkling of Islamic countries as well, Iran being Shia Islam, and the Emirates and what looks to be Saudi Arabia soon as well. This is forming a confederated structure of powers that are not being subsumed like the European project, like the European powers were in the European Union, but they're forming a broader coalition of economic zones and potentially military alliances. They're going to push back hard on the United States and the West if we continue to agitate either in Ukraine or in the Middle East or potentially beyond that in East Asia. And very specifically, what's driving this? Well, we know what's driving this. It's AIPAC, it's Netanyahu's government, it's the Zionist project in the Middle East, which is driving that. That's the reason why there are 2, maybe more carrier strike groups headed for the Middle East or already there as we speak. It's why there is no opposition, whether that's Trump, Biden, or otherwise, to America's interventionist support of its ally, Israel. What that means is a confrontation of some kind is coming, and the East is rising as the West is stagnating and headed for a serious crisis. So these are the 3 major trends or developments in the world that are driving everything. They're driving economies, they're driving the price of gold, they're driving masco-nationalism, they're driving military power, the rebalance of power in the world. The West is entering into the eye of the storm. We are headed into a serious socioeconomic crisis, which is going to unearth all of the tribalism, the balkanization that's ripping these countries apart, from Germany to France to the UK to the United States and Canada. That's going to get worse. There's nothing that Donald Trump can do to stop that. He can try to put masking tape over it. Guys, I don't think it's going to work. I think it's going to boomerang on him, and I think he may be the sacrificial lamb, just as Herbert Hoover was, for an end-of-cycle event that destroys the last 50 or 60 years of multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy, however you want to see it. Both parties are a part of it, and both parties in the United States are going to go down, just as the European Union and the European project is going to collapse in Europe. We are at the end of cycle. So this is the last election in that period of time. It doesn't mean that American republicanism, if you will, is over, is destroyed. I don't necessarily think so. What it does mean is we're entering into the interregnum. We're going into that transition period in which we can't elect our way out of it. And I think that's going to become very clear, maybe by the end of this year, certainly by the beginning of next, that this recent election is not the game changer that people think it is. That being said, that awareness, that awakening that's surging among men in the city all over the Western world, that's about to kick into gear. And I think that is the game changer that everybody's missing. You can't repair systems that are systemically broken or existentially broken. But what you can do is build a new one. You can build a new paradigm. And that's what the neo-masculine movement, that's what this new consciousness, this new awakening across the Western world is going to do. And I think it's going to converge Europe and America together to consolidate around national identity and sovereignty in ways that we haven't seen maybe for 100 years. So exciting times ahead, but difficult times to be sure. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.